3, 4.
What's up, History Peeps? Today we're going to be going over Black history from 1941 with Pearl Harbor all the way to 1954 with the infamous Brown versus Board of Education and the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement as most people understand it. The first thing that we have to talk about is Pearl Harbor. This is where the Japanese attack the United States naval base as negotiations were taking place about trade embargoes and sanctions against the Japanese. And Dory Miller is a second mess sergeant, and he is going to grab an anti-aircraft gun, shoot down a couple of Japanese planes, and he is going to be promoted to mess sergeant first class, and he will be given the Naval Cross by Chester Nimitz, who is the leader of the Navy. And so essentially just his promotion kind of tells you a lot about what's going on in Black America during this time. Like, yes, you shot down Japanese planes, but you're just going to be promoted to mess sergeant first class. And so really, you need to understand that World War II is about the Allies versus the Axis. It's about good in many respects versus evil. And so really, Blacks are going to play a very influential role in what is known as the war effort, from rationing to victory gardens to basically campaign drives to raise more money. And so essentially, there's going to be this group effort, like what are you doing to help your nation? And so you're going to have whites and blacks kind of putting their differences aside, joining together to defeat this common enemy. And hopefully when this common enemy of fascism, when that's destroyed, hopefully Jim Crow will come down as well, as kind of the main goal that we have going on here. So whether it's rationing, whether it's victory gardens, whites and blacks kind of joining together for the cause. And so really, you really need to know, in 1942, there's something called Executive Order 8802, also the Fair Employment Practice Committee. And so what's going to happen is A. Philip Randolph is the head of a union called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and he is going to say, I want an end to military discrimination, and I also want an end to military job discrimination. So I don't want discrimination in the military, and I don't want discrimination in the defense industry. And so he is going to tell FDR, look, if this war is truly about good versus evil, right versus wrong, then let blacks have some say in some of these jobs. Don't let there be discrimination, because if we're going to make, kind of play on Woodrow Wilson's make the world safe for democracy kind of thing, then that shouldn't be playing a role in defense industry jobs. And so he's going to threaten with 10,000 people to march down to the nation's capital. And that looks really bad. If you have 10,000 blacks marching and you're saying that the world is going to be better because of the United States involvement in World War II, that sends a very weird message that FDR really doesn't want to deal with. And so Eleanor Roosevelt actually ends up convincing A. Philip Randolph to call off the march, in agreement that the defense industry jobs will not be segregated from that point forward, and there will be the FEPC, Fair Employment Practices Committee, set up to ensure, to investigate if there are any discriminatory practices happening. Now keep in mind that just because it's more of a recommendation to desegregate. So even if you are a company, I'm just going to say Ford Motor Company, just throwing it out there. Let's say you're Ford Motor Company and you discriminate, the government can't really do anything except for maybe, kind of fine you or make life a little more difficult for you, give you a little less cash than maybe you were getting before because you're helping out the war effort. So it's more of a recommendation, and it doesn't last forever. When the war's over, the South is going to want this thing gone. But for the time being, no discrimination in the defense industry. That's the main takeaway message that you need to know from the Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Practices Committee. Also, with World War II, we had this thing called double victory, and I alluded to it before, where you're defeating fascism abroad and Jim Crow at home. So blacks will partake, because some people are saying, why should blacks partake in World War II? Really, we're being lynched at home. Why should we go and fight on foreign soil to defeat some, crazy dictators? And the agreement is, look, we're going to make the world safe, and then we're also going to make the United States safe by our involvement. And so the Pittsburgh Courier comes up with the term double victory, and it comes out of an article that somebody wrote, a mother wrote, should I sacrifice to live half American? Like, should I participate in the war effort? Because the United States is not really treating me as an equal. And so what's going to happen is the double victory is going to play a role, and that is a very powerful slogan. So So double victory. Victory at home and victory abroad. Defeat fascism, defeat Jim Crow. Also, playing a role here with this double victory, Detroit is the arsenal of democracy. It is the car manufacturer, really, of the world during the time. But it has some serious problems of unemployment, inequality, job discrimination, police brutality. A lot of problems that a lot of American cities have today are happening in Detroit. And so what's going to end up happening is 6,000 troops are going to have to restore order after 600 will be injured, 34 will be dead. And really, you have about, I believe it's $4 million in property damage. And it's just one riot that's taking place. There's a couple others that are taking place during World War II. But the main takeaway message is the arsenal of democracy is also having a race riot during World War II because of job discrimination and all the other inequalities that are taking place in America's cities. And so really the main takeaway message that you need to know is that you can't say that history is so complete that, oh, the United States is good during World War II. The United States is also complex. We have our race issues at home, and we're trying to solve a greater enemy abroad. And so it's always something that you need to think of about with history is it's not so one-dimensional all the time. There's facets of the truth. So arsenal of democracy, but yet race riots at home, and we're trying to get rid of the fascist regimes in the world. Moving on, with black troops, there are so many contributions that blacks do, from the Black Panthers to the Triple Nickels, to women under Charity Adams playing a role in the WACs. And so the main message that you need to know, because you could literally talk about this for years, the main message that you need to know is that blacks are playing a role. They are playing a pivotal role, and they're undergoing, subjugation under Jim Crow. Sometimes they have to prove themselves more than I would say a white person would have to do in battle. And the weird thing is that when they get home, life is going to be rather difficult. So I'm just going to list some names here. Dory Miller, we alluded to before. Kenneth J. Tibbs, the Triple Nickels, 322nd Barrage Infantry Battalion, 51st Heavy Defense, 99th Pursuit Squadron, the Tuskegee Airmen under Benjamin O. Davis. The Port Chicago disaster is where an explosion is going to happen, and during this time, blacks are going to have a pretty difficult time because what's going to happen is that they're the ones that are going to have to load all this ammunition. And so a lot of blacks refuse to go back to work saying, look, we don't mind loading the ammunition, it's dangerous. We just want to know why it's only black guys that are doing it as opposed to white guys as well. You also have what's known as the Black Panthers, 61st Tank Battalion, the 800 Ammunition Company, and then the WACs, to name a couple of contributions. I should probably do a separate video on those, and I probably will in the near future. But essentially what you need to know is that, yes, you have black troops, but when they come back home, there's going to be this Supreme Court decision called Smith versus Allwright. And so Lonnie Smith is a dentist from Houston, and essentially what he says is, I want to vote in the primary. And during this time, Texas is purely Democrat. And they say, sure, you can vote in certain elections. But the thing is, if you can't vote in the primary, you also can't vote in the other elections. And so essentially what you really need to know is that the Supreme Court is going to say blacks should be allowed to vote in the primary because that also gives them access to the other elections as well. And so it does violate the 14th and 15th Amendment because a guy named Allwright, SS Allwright, he is going to stop Lonnie Smith from voting, and then the Supreme Court is going to reverse that decision. Also, in terms of the homecoming, black troops come home to a time when things really don't seem like they've changed too much. It's a time of lynching. Sometimes you have U.S. black veterans returning home and getting lynched in uniform for silly causes. And so you really need to know that there's this guy named George Dorsey, and he is going to be killed along with one of his friends and his wife, who is pregnant, and his friend's wife, who's also pregnant. They get caught because there was an allegation that his friend had stabbed a guy, and so long story short, their car is going to be stopped by the Ku Klux Klan. They're both going to be killed as well as with their pregnant wives. And so that's a pretty horrible story. Isaac Woodard is a World War II veteran returning home in uniform, mind you, and he simply asked for the bus driver to stop so he could use the restroom at the next stop. and the bus driver gets angry, calls him a couple of names, and ends up beating the guy up. The police show up and end up blinding Isaac Woodard, who just returned home, mind you, just returned home from war, still in his uniform. Orson Welles, the famous radio broadcaster, is going to dramatize this on the radio and say that, you know, the nation is blind and this man can clearly see because liberty has a way of doing things, but America is blind. And so even with the GI Bill of Rights, when soldiers returned home, the GI Bill of Rights gave Americans, you know, low interest home loans, free access to education at the university level, and there were some restrictions even for blacks on this as well. So the homecoming, it seems like blacks should be returning home to America that's receiving them with open arms, but really it's, hey, you fought over in Europe, that was fine, but you mind your place when you return home is kind of the message in a lot of places. But that's not going to stand for long. Next up is Morgan versus Virginia. And Irene Morgan, she is traveling from Virginia, where she recently had a miscarriage, and she's going home to Baltimore. And so essentially what she's saying is she refuses to give up her seat. She's Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks. And so the main argument that she's going to be arrested, and the main argument that she is going to use in this court case is that it violates Interstate Commerce Commission's policy about interstate transportation. And eventually, like, she's going to be found guilty on the local level, but at the Supreme Court, they're going to reverse the decision. And so interstate busing should be desegregated because it violates the interstate commerce. And when you interfere with interstate commerce, you're messing with the Constitution of the United States, and that's a federal felony. So the homecoming that blacks are receiving is not good. And so Harry S. Truman, he's going to be outraged by these lynchings that are taking place. And he actually speaks in front of the Lincoln Memorial addressing civil rights. And so he's the first president to publicly say, I support civil rights. And this used to be considered political suicide. But he's taking a step and he's doing it. And so he also creates something called the Presidential Committee on Civil Rights, comes from to secure these rights. And essentially what they're going to do is they're going to set up the policy that's going to dominate civil rights for the next 25 years, where there needs to be an investigative committee set up that you shouldn't be discriminating. If you are caught discriminating, you should get funds cut from you. There should be a system put in place on the judicial branch to investigate crimes against civil rights. And so really what you need to know is that in 1948, Truman is going to run for president and he's going to win. And it's largely based on civil rights. So it's no longer political suicide. He's actually saying, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go ahead with it. And we'll talk more about that here in a little bit. In the meantime, 1947, Jackie Robinson with the Brooklyn Dodgers is going to break the, color barrier. And essentially that's a big thing. Now it's happening also in football. It's happening also in other sports. But Jackie Robinson is really going to be the hallmark of breaking down racial barriers. In other news, just kind of a quick summary with the Cold War, you have this good versus evil thing again, that the United States is good and we're on the side of God and the Russians are evil and they're plotting things. So a lot of things are happening abroad. I'm just going to name a couple here. You have Winston Churchill giving the famous Iron Curtain speech. You have the atomic bombs, then the hydrogen bombs. You have China becoming communist. You have the Berlin airlift. You have the Marshall Plan. You have a lot of things happening in terms of us trying to contain communism versus Russians trying to expand upon that. And so at home we have, let's just simplify things. You have McCarthyism. You have the Rosenberg trials. You have these strikes and this fear of communism. You're going to have, in the not too distant future, you're going to have Sputnik going up in space. And so you have these Levitt homes for the middle class. So you have a lot of things happening within the Cold War. And really, civil rights, the big message you need to know is going to have to take a step back from that in terms of what are the presidents going to address. The big agenda item is going to be, we need to stop communism from spreading. And in civil rights, politicians are going to largely have to be forced into it because of mass protests and civil disobedience. So now we move on to the election of 1948, and you have a couple different candidates. You have Harry S. Truman running as a Democrat. He doesn't seem like he has a chance in hell to win. You also are going to have the Progressive Party. You're going to have the Dixiecrats under Strom Thurmond, and you're going to have the Republicans under Thomas Dewey, who was governor of New York, and it seems like Thomas Dewey's going to win. But an interesting thing to know is that the Democratic Party is split. Harry S. Truman said that he supported civil rights. However, Strom Thurmond is going to say, if you're going to support civil rights, then we're walking out of the Democratic Convention and we are going to nominate our own people. And so 33 delegates leave, and they form what are known as the Dixiecrats. Democrats who are loyal to the Jim Crow way of life. And Strom Thurmond is going to play a role in that. Also in the election of 1948, you have what's known as a fair deal. It's kind of FDR's New Deal, part 3, because there was part 1, part 2 of the New Deal, and now it's the fair deal, talking about universal health care for people. He aligns with Midwestern farmers, with urban poor, with blacks, to try to make America better for all. What does the government owe the people? Well, it owes them certain obligations, according to the Democratic policy during this time. Long story short, what you need to know is that Harry S. Truman comes out and wins this thing, and it's a big surprise. Even the Chicago Daily Tribune showed that, the famous newspaper says that Dewey defeats Truman, and Harry S. Truman holds it up and says, really? I think I just won this election. And so that is going to be a good thing for civil rights, because Harry S. Truman, the candidate that said that he supported civil rights, is going to push this agenda forward. In other news, what you need to know is that Harry S. Truman goes ahead and executes Executive Order 9981, and it's a committee against Jim Crow and military service and training. And so it's going to be led by civil rights activists, and you're going to have Thurgood Marshall, of course, at the center of a lot of things, and then you're going to have Grant Reynolds also playing a role. And basically what it does is it ends military discrimination. Now it sets the policy, it says this is going to happen, and then the time frame officially takes place under Eisenhower's administration. And so that's going to be a pretty good thing, where now it used to be that if you were black and you were in the military, you would be given the subservient jobs, and now it's going to try to create equality. And there's been commissions that have been set up, and they've said, yes, when whites and blacks fight alongside one another, they don't really see in terms of race when you're on the battlefield. And many generals are saying that whites and blacks can fight just as well. I don't know where the public is getting this image of blacks not being able to fight as well. They're proving themselves. I mean, just look at the record on World War II. But officially during the Korean War, the military will officially be desegregated. In other news here, the Yalta Conference is going to be this meeting about dividing what does post-World War II, what does that world look like? And so essentially it's going to replace, the United Nations is going to replace the League of Nations, and essentially they're going to create this Declaration of Human Rights. And so 30 some odd rights talking about how the world is going to be better, how we're not going to live in fear as the world was under the Nazi regime. And so Paul Robeson, a couple of years later, is going to approach the United Nations, and he's a very famous actor. He had some communist leanings back in the day. And so he brings this document saying, we charge genocide against the United States. And keep in mind, the United States is like right in front at this meeting. And he says, we charge genocide. We are charging the United States with lynching its own people. And based on the definition of genocide, where you use fear and tactics to get rid of somebody based on fear because of who they are, we are charging genocide against the United States. Some people in the civil rights movement say that was too far, that was too big of a thing to say, and so they kind of distanced themselves from Paul Robeson forever after that. But it is an important moment in civil rights, because it says that, on the world stage, blacks are taking a stand and saying that this system in place that we have dealt with since Reconstruction has got to go. Especially if we're going to say that we're the moral people in the world in this Cold War that we find ourselves in. In other news, the Korean War, you're going to have, about 40,000 U.S. deaths. A very tragic thing about containment of communism. And blacks are going to be playing a role with William Thompson and Daniel Chappie James, a pilot, and Cornelius H. Charlton. And so they're all going to be playing a role. Again, look, we are fighting for democracy. We always have fought for democracy. And when we return home, we expect to be treated as equal citizens. And so what you also need to know is that during the Korean War, you're actually going to have the Executive Order 9981 officially be implemented under Eisenhower's administration. So we're almost there. Lots of stuff in this post-war period to discuss here. But the next thing on the agenda is WDIA, and that's a Memphis radio station. What they notice is that their ratings are going down. They're not really making it, and so they decide to take a risk and they start playing black music. And this is really the start of rock and roll. And so it first aired it, and then all of a sudden this radio station becomes, I think in the next year it becomes number 2 in the area, and then it's quickly rising. And so playing of black music, and this brings up some fears of conservative Americans that, look, if our children start listening to black music, then maybe they'll start dating blacks, and maybe they'll start, having these mixed sexual encounters. Ooh. And so conservative America's kind of going to go crazy with that. And so rock and roll music, this is really the defining piece of the 1950s and late 1940s. And so you're going to combine black music of jazz and blues coming together under this rock and roll. Alan Freed is a Cleveland disc jockey, and he really makes it famous. He begins playing black records. And so you're going to have people like Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, Bill Haley, who's actually white, playing black music, and Elvis Presley is going to be a white guy becoming famous because he sings like a black man and he shakes his hips and stirs the fears of conservative America. And you're also going to have Little Richard and the rise of Motown. So the 1950s, it's characterized by black music, and so it brings up that discussion piece about, you accept black music, but do you accept black culture as well? To what degree does America go along and accept full equality is a very interesting discussion piece you can have. But now we're in the final pieces here with some civil rights victories before you get to the famous Brown versus Board of Education. The Shelleys and Shelley versus Kramer, they are a family in St. Louis, and they have bought a white property, and there's this thing about housing contracts. And so Louis Kramer, he lives about 10 blocks away, and he says, well, if those black people move into this neighborhood, our property values are going to go down. And so it reaches the Supreme Court, and it says that the courts can't enforce racial housing covenants because it's based on private property in the United States, and if a white person wants to sell their property to a black person, if they have the money, then they should be free to do so. And so it's really one of those first victories in the civil rights movement, and it will really intensify when you get to the 1968 Civil Rights Act, kind of taking Shelley versus Kramer a step forward. In other news, 2 court cases that are going to happen be decided on the same day: Sweat versus Painter. And Heman Marion Sweat is going to try to get into the Texas Law School at Austin. They're going to say, no, you can't go. And then in the meantime, they're going to try to build a separate law school for him to go to. And ultimately, what you really need to know is that the Supreme Court says you can't do that. Even though you created separate facilities, that doesn't mean that they're equal. So it's really the attack on separate but equal for really the first major time. And so eventually he's going to, have to be allowed into the university. But ironically, he kind of goes missing. He becomes famous for this court case, but nobody really knows what happens to him. Some people say maybe he was lynched. A lot of his friends say he was kind of this guy that just, was kind of a traveler. So I think he didn't really want to deal with the integration, that he wanted to, win the court case and then kind of went about his business. So nobody truly knows what happens to him after he won the Supreme Court case. And you also have George McLaurin versus Oklahoma Board of Regents. And this guy is black, and he has already a master's degree in education. He wants to go to the University of Oklahoma. They say no. Eventually it reaches an appeal, and they say, you can go. And so they allow him to go. But Oklahoma says, okay, you can go, but you're going to sit outside the classroom. And keep in mind, this is a grown man. I believe he's 70 some odd years old, 60s. I could be wrong. But he's a grown man sitting outside of the classroom. Very famous picture of him sitting literally outside the room. At the library, they gave him a table, but it's in one of the most noisiest sections of the library. In the cafeteria, he has a table to himself. So he's not allowed to integrate. And so basically, George McLaurin says this is not right, and it ultimately goes all the way to the Supreme Court, because at the local level they were saying, well, it stands. I mean, you got your education, and you just have to sit in a separate area. What are you complaining about? And ultimately, the Supreme Court is going to say, no, you can't do that. It has to be full integration, not this half-hearted thing that you're going for. So really you have housing discrimination under attack, and you also have education at the university levels being under attack. And that brings us to the Brown versus Board of Education, named after Linda Brown, who is a third grader. And so she is going to have to, essentially her story is, she is going to have to walk 6 blocks to get onto a bus to take her across railroad tracks to take her to her school. Which is another 6 or 7 blocks away. And the argument is that there is a white school that is 7 blocks away. Why can't she go to that school? And so her father is going to be very well respected, Oliver Brown. And so this court case is going to be decided by Thurgood Marshall. This is really going to make him famous. And Chief Justice Earl Warren is going to rule unanimously that separate but equal has no place in American society. And so this system of Plessy versus Ferguson that has been in place since 1896 is unanimously struck down. And the cool thing that you need to know is that Plessy versus Ferguson was almost unanimous in its decision. Only one lone dissenter, John Marshall Harlan. And now you have the Supreme Court unanimously deciding this. And Eisenhower, who appointed Chief Justice Earl Warren, is going to be kind of aghast, saying, what just happened here? Maybe appointing this guy was a damned mistake. And so what you're going to have from the South is massive resistance. They're not going to want to go through with this. And so you're going to have schools that are going to shut down. You're going to have all this movement of kids into private schools. You're going to have public education, you know, in some cases the lost years where they don't offer education except at the private university level. But for the time being, what you need to know is that 1954, Brown versus Board, changes everything. And the modern civil rights movement, as most people understand it, has begun. But there are frameworks in place, from black soldiers in World War II to executive orders to breakdown in sports to elections and presidents that are now going to support. So the framework is in place for us to take this civil rights movement and push forward with it. So there you go, Black history from 1941 to 1954. May the force be with you, and study those notes.